We have our Linux server running in VirtualBox, and I'm going to log in PuTTY, and my username and password, and I want to look at some information about my hardware and possibly my operating system. That information is stored in many different places in our system. We're going to use a few applications to get easy access to that information. But first, if we change into the root directory, we see there are a number of subdirectories. Some of them that contain information about hardware is within the /dev directory, devices. So disks, network devices, different hardware devices, the operating system keeps track of them in the dev directory. Regarding software processes, historically that was stored in the proc directory, but in fact Linux stores a lot of information, or gives the user access to a lot of information about the Linux kernel via this proc directory. And it's trying to split that up and leave the pure process stuff there and put other system information in the sys directory. So the point there are three important directories in a Linux machine: dev, sys and proc, which give the user access to information about the hardware and the operating system. So we can get it from there, but it's nicer to use some specialized applications to give us some information. One of them is LSHW, and we need to install that. So I'll install LSHW. It's not currently installed. It's LS for list, HW hardware. Provides us a very nice output which lists our hardware. And if I run LSHW, it shows me a long output of the hardware it detects, and I'll scroll up and we'll go through quickly some of those things, noting that this Linux machine is running inside VirtualBox, so there's no actual hardware, there's virtual hardware, although some of it from my laptop is passed through. Some of the information may not be displayed because I didn't run it as superuser, so if I preceded the command with sudo I may get a bit more, but not much. So it's showing that I have some memory, in this case about 500 megabytes. I set up with a 512 megabytes for RAM. The CPU, this is showing actually my laptop CPU, the Intel i5, and some capabilities or features of the CPU. And then other hardware like the PCI bridge and PCI devices, most of them will be virtualized, provided by VirtualBox. The display, the virtual VGA display, which is not very important in this case, the virtual network device, an Intel LAN card. That's a virtual device. The actual device on my laptop is different, but VirtualBox presents it to Linux as this virtual Intel Ethernet card. And a number of other devices like audio, USB bridges, storage devices, the SATA controller and disk drives. And down the bottom the CD-ROM. So LSHW is one way to see some information about our hardware. Similar commands which show details about PCI and USB devices. There's LSPCI, which gives a list of PCI devices, and LSUSB, similar for USB devices, which is not much in this case. When Linux is running on real computers, on real hardware, this can be quite useful because you can identify the different devices, PCI, USB and other, using LSHW, LSPCI and LSUSB. As with many commands, in Linux there are many options. One of them, if you want more information, you want a verbose output, add the -v option, and it gives details about those USB devices in this case. Many details of the USB devices. Similar with LSPCI. It gives details of all those PCI devices. So that's a little bit about the hardware. What about disks? Different ways to see disk space. and the partitions and the structure of the file system. One is using DF. DF presents some summary information about in this case, the mounted partitions. And it's a little bit complicated because there are some temporary file systems that Linux sets up, but the main one here is the root directory, which is referring to the SDA1, which is a disk device. That's my main disk, and the output is a little bit easier if we show it in human-friendly form, the -H option, and it shows my disk space here has a total size of 2 gig, and I've used 1.1 gig. So that's very useful information. The other temporary file system, the one we note here, this 245 meg, this is related to the swap drive, which is used for virtual memory. So if you recall, I set up my disk with 2.5 gig. Linux, when it installed, it allocated about 500 meg for virtual memory, swap space, and about 2 gig for the actual storage of files. Other information we can see about the operating system. LSB release tells us something about the Ubuntu version we're running, and we need the -A option here to get anything useful. This tells us we're running Ubuntu 16.04.3 long-term support, the version of Ubuntu we're running. And Ubuntu uses the Linux kernel. One way to see information about the version of the Linux kernel, uname -A, Linux, and the kernel version is 4.4.0-87 generic, and some other details about that it's a 64-bit operating system. So there we have a few commands that will give us information about our computer, the hardware and the software, and especially the operating system. LSHW, LSPCI, LSUSB for hardware, DF for disk space, LSB release, and uname for the operating system information.